I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Russia continues its mechanized push in the Donetsk region, we continue reporting on the corruption bill that has shaken Ukraine all of last week, with MPs now fearing revenge if they were to reinstate anti-corruption agencies in a U-turn law. Meanwhile, Russia cancels its annual Navy Day parade for security reasons. Russian tourists continue flocking to Europe for their holidays, and we chat with Ukraine's ambassador to Australia and New Zealand.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 28th of July, 3 years and 156 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Executive Editor for Audio Francis Dearnley and Europe Editor James Crisp. Later, you'll hear Associate Defence Editor Dom Nicholls speak to the ambassador. But first, let's turn to the military updates.
A busy weekend and morning, both in the air and on the ground. Let's start with the former, when, at around 10:30 p.m. local time last night, explosions rocked Kyiv amid another large wave of drone and missile strikes on several regions of the country. At least 8 people were injured in the attack on the capital, including a 3-year-old child. A high-rise apartment building was damaged, the blast shattering windows from the 6th to the 11th floors. 4 people were hospitalised, with 1 in a critical condition. More explosions were heard then at 4 a.m. And that attack was followed by loud thunderstorms this morning, which set off car alarms across the city. As Jimmy Rushton, who joined me on the podcast last week, put it, it's not an entirely pleasant experience, considering it sounds pretty much exactly like incoming missiles. Meanwhile, at least 9 explosions were heard in Kirovohrad Oblast and hypersonic missiles heard in western Khmelnytsky Oblast, the location of an airbase of the 7th Tactical Aviation Brigade of Ukraine's Air Force. Overall, according to said Air Force, Russia launched 324 drones, 4 cruise missiles and 3 aeroballistic missiles against Ukraine last night, and claimed they intercepted 309 drones and 2 missiles. There was also another sizable attack on Saturday night, with ballistic missiles targeting Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia oblasts. Earlier in the day, a glide bomb had already killed 1 in Kharkiv and injured 17, including a child. 1 was killed in Dnipropetrovsk and 1 in Dnipro. Multiple fires broke out in Zaporizhia and several civilian buildings were damaged there. On Sunday, it was Odessa that was hit by an attempted drone swarm during the day, though footage shows that beachgoers were rather nonplussed, calmly watching one Shahed shot down over the sea, perhaps on that very boat that Dom and I sailed on a few weeks ago. One drone also was reportedly filmed flying about 200 metres over Vilnius in Lithuania, having gone off course and entered Lithuanian airspace from Belarus. As these larger-scale attacks increase, we can expect similar violations of NATO airspace. And that is something not without ramifications, as Joe Barnes emphasised in Friday's episode when relaying that story of how the Polish embassy being hit in Kyiv triggered Trump's U-turn. Given the increased frequency of these large-scale aerial bombardments, it should come as no surprise President Zelensky urged yesterday that Ukrainian drone manufacturers had to boost production and ensure the country can launch at least 1,000 interceptor drones every day. While we're on the subject, the Russians have also reported attacks and a new Ukrainian pulse electronic jamming UAV accompanying a recent strike on Sochi. Pulse jammers apparently send out brief, intense bursts of energy to disrupt the radar and communication systems. The Russians say this resulted in the failure of some of their air defences. That is interesting, if true. Turning to the front lines, I'm going to start at between 3 and 4 p.m. on our imaginary clock face, as Russian troops are confirmed to advance between the towns of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka in Donetsk. A spokesman for the Ukrainian forces there stressed there's no immediate threat to Pokrovsk, as such an attack would incur heavy losses for Russian forces, who are instead trying to bypass the town and encircle it. He said there is no particular point in entering the town at this time except to complicate the situation for our drone operators, forcing them to retreat slightly rather than engage in the destruction of Russians. Despite all the forces they currently have, he continued, they still do not have enough people to repeat the human wave assaults that took place in Mariupol and Bakhmut. They would simply be completely wasted. That is why they are trying to take partial control of the city. Now, just since I mentioned Mariupol, freelance journalist Tom Much has just published a book called The Dogs of Mariupol, which provides a vivid account of those early battles of the war, as well as some lesser-known stories, like the 1st Tank Brigade's defence of Chernihiv and the guerrilla army that fought overwhelming odds in Sumy. For anyone studying those initial phases of the conflict particularly, it will be an important source. Now, staying with Pokrovsk, footage released over the weekend reportedly shows an entire Russian convoy being destroyed by the artillery and assault teams of Ukraine's 155th Separate Mechanised Brigade, utilising precision fire. It speaks again to just how fierce the fighting is there at the moment. Some are calculating that in that sector we are seeing some of the highest casualty figures seen for many months on any front. In Donetsk, the ISW and others report Russian forces recently advanced as well northeast of Seversk during a reinforced company-sized mechanised assault. The Ukrainian brigade that repelled the attack reported Russian forces used 6 tanks, 3 armoured personnel carriers, 6 armoured fighting vehicles, an armoured recovery vehicle, 12 civilian vehicles, 2 buggies and 41 motorcycles. Now, Luke Harding of The Guardian has just written a compelling dispatch from one of the small agricultural villages between Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk oblasts, speaking to locals still living there. One describes how a missile fell on his house. I heard bang. My shed was gone in a split second. There was nothing left. It was probably a glide bomb or something similar. He was forced to free his animals and set off on foot for hours across the fields. An interesting snippet as well from the piece is when Luke quotes a combat officer in a local Ukrainian brigade, who says the Russians exaggerate their battlefield gains for propaganda purposes, sustaining colossal losses in manpower to achieve the fleeting appearance of success. He says a couple of Russian soldiers raise a flag next to a village. Minutes later, we wipe them out. That is just worth bearing in mind whenever one sees Russian flags raised over certain settlements. That is something we've reported recently. Turning to 2 o'clock on our clock face, in Kharkiv Oblast, Moscow's forces are making headway toward Kupiansk from the northwest, pushing past Moskovka and moving in the direction of Sobolivka. Following setbacks in their earlier attempt to advance from Radkivka, they now seem to be probing west of the city in an apparent effort to outflank Ukrainian defences. The movement towards Sobolivka stands out as a key indicator of where the offensive might be aimed. If Russian forces continue on this axis, they could compromise that vital logistical corridor there. Analysts say this particular route is essential for troop rotations, supply deliveries and potential evacuations. While its capture wouldn't isolate Kupiansk completely, it would place significant strain on its defensive posture. As the ISW summarises on this campaign, the Russian military command could pursue at least 3 courses of action following a future seizure of Kupiansk. While unlikely in the short term, it would present the military command with a decision point. They could either continue pushing west from Kupiansk, reprioritise Russian advances in the Borova and Liman direction, or redeploy from Kupiansk to higher priority directions, such as Konstantinivka, Pokrovsk or Novopavlivka directions. Any of these would likely require months' worth of personnel and material to accomplish, although the exact timeline of Russia's ability to achieve the various objectives is dependent on the level of US and Western military assistance Ukraine continues to receive. Now, just while we're on the subject of Kharkiv, I should add that Ukraine claims Russian Colonel Lebedev, commander of the 83rd Motorised Rifle Regiment of the 69th Motorised Rifle Division, was killed leading assault operations in the Veliki Bolok area of Kharkiv Oblast. Lastly, at around 1 p.m. on our clock face, Russian forces continued to conduct limited attacks in unspecified areas of Kursk Oblast. An unusual piece in The Insider interviewing police officers and government officials in Russia's borderlands like Kyiv provides a fascinating insight into how life has changed in these places, including Belgorod. To quote it, "Life in Russia's frontline regions looks very different from day-to-day existence in the rest of the country. Strikes have become a regular occurrence, and the construction of fortifications serves as a constant reminder the situation can still get much, much worse." The Insider sought to understand how the war looks through the eyes of state employees working on the edge of the conflict. It turns out they don't share the enthusiasm prevalent in government propaganda. Silence, it turns out, does not always mean consent. Now, they go on to quote one of the officials. "Inside the system, we've already reached the stage of indifference at every level. The higher-ups have come to terms with the fact that this could all end in the worst and most unexpected way. They've taken care of their families' futures, and the rest is out of their hands. Among colleagues, whether at work or at informal gatherings, no one brings up the war anymore. You never know who might snitch on you. Even among family, there are no more arguments. Everyone sees things in their own way, and no one's changing their mind." Another official quoted in the piece, "Once a year, the psychologists check us out, give us some forms to fill out, a few tests. It feels like something out of Blade Runner. They want to see if you're stable or if something's off. But it's all just a formality." And the piece ends with this testimony. "President Putin talked about action, but I get the feeling he's the only one enjoying all this. He must be living in his own reality. Nobody in our administration expects things to get better. There's no optimism, only a strong feeling that this whole nightmare we're living through might one day seem like the good old days." We'll link to that unique piece in the show notes, along with the others cited today. I just want to end, though, with two smaller stories. First, the reports that a Russian Su-27UB fighter jet caught fire at the Amarvia airfield in Russia's Krasnodar Krai, which Ukraine's military intelligence hint was an act of Russian sabotage. "Resistance to the Kremlin regime inside Russia is growing," they said in a statement. They also released video footage suggesting that a Molotov cocktail or a similar incendiary device was used to ignite the aircraft, which bursts into flames shortly after. Obviously, we should treat any claims like that with healthy scepticism, but it is remarkable footage. And just lastly, Aeroflot, Russia's largest airline, reported a massive malfunction in its information system today, forcing the cancellation of dozens of flights from across Moscow. A pro-Ukrainian hacker group named Silent Crow has claimed responsibility for the attack on its IT infrastructure, allegedly conducted in cooperation with the Belarusian opposition hacktivist group, the Cyber Partisans BY. For a year, we were inside their corporate network, they claim, methodically developing access, going deep into the very core of their infrastructure. Airport disruption is, as we've reported now, becoming a very, very serious and expensive problem for the Russian government, with cancellations taking place several days in a row last week, and now this. Whether the efforts are coordinated, we can't say. But nonetheless, if you're listening to this in Moscow and hoping to catch a flight anytime soon, I would pack a sleeping bag for the airport. But that's where we are, Adélie, with the major military updates.
And now for the political updates. We're still following very closely the corruption bill that set off scores of protests across Ukraine last week. As you know, last week Zelensky signed a bill targeting the independence of anti-corruption agencies, which set off scores of protests across Ukraine. And after several days, on Friday the 25th, Zelensky made a U-turn and submitted a bill to restore the independence of the two corruption agencies targeted by the initial bill, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAPO. But passing this reversal bill through Parliament might prove more complicated than expected. In the Financial Times this morning, Christopher Miller reports that as many as 70 MPs from Zelensky's party are potentially refusing to vote to restore the independence of Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies. They fear that prosecutors might take revenge against them. The new bill will be considered by Parliament on July 31st, at the end of this week. But, the Financial Times says, given the doubts over whether the MPs will be backing the legislation, it may be delayed or tabled at a time when there are too few MPs present to pass it. As the Ukrainian parliament is then in recess for 4 weeks in August, this could push the vote all the way down to September. Meanwhile, it's unclear what is going to happen to pending investigations and whether people under scrutiny could potentially cover up their tracks. Fear of retribution arose after the publication of an interview with Alexander Klimenko, the head of one of the agencies, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, or SAPO. He spoke to Suspilny, a Ukrainian broadcaster, and said, "We will analyze all the situations, events, statements, all the accusations and claims against us, down to the molecules. We will recreate the chronology of events second by second and give an analysis of all of this." In an interview with the Financial Times, he added, "Only people involved in corrupt schemes have reason to fear NABU and SAPO. We have never engaged in political persecution. All investigations by NABU and SAPO were based totally on facts and evidence, not on political positions or the votes of members of parliament." Zelensky said that the revised bill included new provisions aimed at protecting against influence by Russia's spy agencies. I quote, "primarily in response to cases involving representative of NABU, which is what had sparked the initial bill, accusations which have yet to be substantiated." And these provisions call for employees of all law enforcement agencies, that's including NABU and SAPO, who have relatives either originating from or residing in Russia, to undergo polygraph tests every 2 years. Meanwhile, yesterday, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen urged Zelensky to uphold the independence of the nation's anti-corruption bodies. On X, she said that Ukraine had already achieved a lot on its European path and it must build on these solid foundations and preserve independent anti-corruption bodies, which are cornerstones of Ukraine's rule of law. She further pledged the European Union's ongoing support for Ukraine's aspirations for EU membership, adding that Ukraine can count on the support to deliver progress on its European path. Now, these anti-corruption bodies were implemented after the Euromaidan protests as a way to continue democratizing Ukraine and pave the way for a future European Union membership. The Ukrainian civil society and the press are left to ponder how the initial law came to pass in such a sudden authoritarian move. The Kyiv Indy published this weekend a deep dive into Zelensky's top allies who'd recently been under scrutiny. That includes Deputy Prime Minister Oleksiy Chernyshov, who was charged in June with bribery and abuse of power. He is the 6th suspect in a large-scale corruption scheme led by a property developer from Kyiv, who illegally claimed a land plot to build a residential complex. And sources from NABU told the Kyiv Indy that they believe that this case was one of the factors that prompted the authorities to pass the bill. Also in June, NABU arrested a relative of Zelensky's business partner Timo Mindic, who was charged with embezzling $16 million from the electric power company Kharkiv-Oblenergo. Closer to the president, the Indy notes are several of Zelensky's top aides who have been under scrutiny at various points over the last 5 years. Zelensky's former deputy chief of staff, Andriy Smirnov, was charged by NABU with an illicit enrichment in 2024 and money laundering and receiving a bribe in April 2025. Another deputy chief of staff, Oleg Tatarov, was charged in 2020 with giving a bribe to an official before he joined the president's office. Prosecutors and courts had obstructed the case and it was eventually closed. Unlike Smirnov, Tatarov has not resigned and Zelensky has refused to fire him. Another corruption case targeted the brother of Zelensky's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak. The case was opened in 2020 when videos appeared of Denis Yermak considering candidates for government jobs and discussing receiving money from some of them. And the article notes that many lawmakers from Zelensky's Servant of the People party also face corruption charges. Now, in other diplomatic news, Russia's annual Navy Day parade has been cancelled for security reasons. The event is traditionally held on the last Sunday of July and was called off presumably after a wave of drone attacks disrupted airports and railways across western Russia overnight on July 27th. although Dmitry Peskov didn't specify anything other than the general situation. The parade, which is usually televised and attended by President Putin, usually features a flotilla of warships and military vessels sailing down the Neva River. It is the first time the parade has been cancelled since its inception in 2017. Next up, we have Donald Trump, who on Friday, July 25th, said that secondary sanctions could be imposed against Russia. When asked about the timeline and whether they could come before the 50-day deadline he announced earlier this month, he answered, maybe. As ever, it's hard to put stock on these declarations and whether anything will come of it, but we'll obviously keep an eye on what unfolds. And finally, on Saturday, Austrian Foreign Minister Beate Myroshnychenko said in an interview with German newspaper Die Welt that she was willing to engage in a national debate about the country's potential accession to NATO. She said that neutrality alone will not protect us. Now, Austria declared neutrality in 1955, when the Allied forces, including the USSR, withdrew from its territory. It then regained its full independence, and the provision for permanent neutrality was enshrined in its constitution. Austria has not been a member of NATO, but cooperates with the alliance, for example, within the framework of the Partnership for Peace program. It should be noted that many are deeply skeptical that Austria would join the alliance anytime soon. They're considered highly compromised by the Russians, and some imagine a similar scenario to having a country like the Hungarians in the EU. But nonetheless, it's an interesting thing to flag, and we'll definitely keep an eye on what happens. Staying on the diplomatic theme, let's turn to our Europe editor James Crisp now, who has an update on Russian tourists in Europe. James, what's the story?
Yes, hello, good afternoon. So, listen, me and some of my colleagues have been crunching some data. Our data team has looked into this, and we've looked at three things. We've looked at how many nights Russian people have spent in hotels in Europe over the last year, how many nights they've booked on websites like Booking.com, Airbnb. This is publicly available data. It's collected. You know, when you go on holiday to Europe, it asks you for your nationality. That all goes into a database or gets sent to the EU Statistics Agency. And then occasionally, you know, someone like me and our data team call up and ask for it. That's how we've got it. We've also had a look at Schengen visas. Now, Schengen is the EU's passport-free zone of free movement. And if you are a non-EU citizen, like a Russian, who does not benefit from visa-free travel, like a Russian, you have to apply for a visa to get in. So we've had a look at that as well over the last year. And what we've seen is that there are three holiday destinations for Russian tourists which stand out. Italy is number one, France is number two, and Spain is number three. Now, actually, Russian tourist numbers to Spain have dropped, but they were so high, but they're still the third most popular location. Now, why is this a problem, would be the question. The answer is that the people who are doing these trips almost certainly aren't ordinary Russians. Listeners to this podcast will probably remember, but shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, there was a ban on the UK and in the EU on Russian airlines landing in European and British airports. So you can't get an Aeroflot from Moscow to London anymore. So that means if I am a Russian who wants to go on holiday to Europe, I need to fly to another country first. So that could be Turkey, the UAE, a country outside of the EU. Then I also have to have applied for a visa ahead of time, which is not cheap. I'd probably have to stay a night in Turkey. Then there's the sanctions to think of. My Russian bank card won't work in the EU. So I've got to then change my rubles into euros, maybe at Istanbul's airport. And I've got to get on the plane, fly in, and begin my holiday properly. So that is a significant cost, right? And that is beyond the reach of most ordinary Russians, which leads us to suspect that maybe what we're talking about here are, if not oligarchs, then perhaps minigarchs. And having spoken to a number of people, the Ukrainian ambassador to the EU, Bill Browder, their belief is that a lot of these better off Russians are actually quite enthusiastic supporters of the war in Ukraine. So these are people who, frankly, should not be coming to Europe, should not be coming to the UK. For a number of reasons. One, it's a security risk. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who comes over for their hollybobs is looking to bribe a bunch of officials or awaken a sleeper cell, but the fact is that if you remember the Skripals, they came over on a tourist visa. It is a concern. Russia is waging a hybrid war against the West at the moment. We all know that. I guess the other issue would be sanctions. So the West, UK and EU, have imposed loads of sanctions on Russia. Now, a lot of that has stopped short of a full travel ban unless you are a specifically named person, one of Putin's cronies. You've done something specific in Ukraine, then you would face an asset freeze and a travel ban. But there's been a reluctance to put a blanket ban on all Russian tourists. But what has happened is there's a visa facilitation agreement between the EU and Russia that was suspended immediately, which means if I'm a Russian, I have to go through a lengthier, more expensive process before my visa gets stamped. There is guidance from the European Commission, which says basically, please, member states, take quite a prejudiced view of any tourist visas. And Europe, as ever, is divided. So if I am in the Czech Republic or the Baltics, Poland, I will probably not be issuing any tourist visas. But if I'm in Rome or Paris or Madrid, Barcelona, wherever, there seems to be a slightly more lax way of going about things. And that's also a problem because if you're a member of a Schengen zone and you have your Schengen visa, you can go into Paris and then you can go to The Hague. You can travel all around this passport-free area without any further restrictions. So we've spoken to the foreign minister of the Czech Republic, who, for a chief diplomat, is pretty close in the article to being very undiplomatic about his fellow EU countries who are basically undermining the sanctions and opening up this back door where you have people who support the war in Ukraine coming over and enjoying all the benefits that a European holiday has to offer.
What is the reason given by these European states who still allow Russian tourists? So France, Italy, Spain, do they have a specific line?
Yeah. So we spoke to Italy. Spain didn't get back to us. Italy did. And Italy said, look, our argument is with the Russian government, not with the Russian people. The French did not respond to this, but they have responded to other accusations about the visas. And they say, but look, there's a benefit on these in a kind of cultural exchange. And again, they make the argument that ordinary Russian people shouldn't be punished. But the counter argument would be, but these are not ordinary Russian people who are coming over. And if you didn't want to punish ordinary Russian people for the conduct of their government, you couldn't really justify having sanctions on their economy in the first place. Because it's not Putin who's suffering because of the sanctions, it's ordinary Russian people. Now, look, if you had a situation, I think one of the more bizarre arguments that I've seen is that these kind of cultural exchanges give a kind of fillip to dissidents, I guess, by showing what a free society is like. I don't think that's very convincing. I mean, one thing which is convincing, I spoke to a Russian investigative journalist called Andrei Soldatov, who made quite a strong point, which was that these visas are actually a lifeline for Russian dissidents. So if you say, no, we can have no tourist visas, or as some people who I spoke to while researching this suggested, that you have to declare you oppose Putin and his regime before coming to Europe, that would obviously make those people instantly a target for Putin's regime. You can't have a special dissident-only visa, because if you go into the embassy and say, can I have a dissident-only visa, when you come out, you'll get, well, who knows? You might end up falling out of a window or something.
Yes, that doesn't seem like a very practical idea to have a dissident-only visa. And on what ground would you decide that on top of it? The final question for me, do we know if there's any pushback locally in the places that these Russian tourists go to on holiday? Is there any civil society pushback? Are they welcome?
The simple answer is that because the data doesn't show exactly where everyone is going, we're not sure. But it's no secret, right, that tourism is an important part of Europe's economy. If you are in Greece, for example, where you get this huge, massive increase in tourism every year, you're probably quite happy for Russians to come over and spend their money, or at least why rock the boat? I mean, one of the other countries which has shown a big increase in visas is our old friend Hungary, who've seen a 13% increase. I think it's in visas or hotel nights in Budapest. So I think in Hungary, the chances are that they are welcomed with open arms, given Viktor Orban's track record of, how should we put it, pro-Putin sympathies, I suppose, or at least soft on Putin. So for me, with my sort of European political hat on, what's interesting is that you have Western European countries who are NATO allies, EU member states. The EU does talk a very good game in supporting Ukraine. It's actually done a lot of very good things. You've got members of Coalition of the Willing, France, who leads it with Britain, saying all the right things, wanting to ramp up defense spending. But at the same time, if no one's watching, we'll still take the money if you want to come over and have a jolly for a few days and head down the Champs-Élysées and load up on your Hermes handbags and have a trot round the Vatican, whatever it is that you fancy doing.
Definitely. I remember reading after the beginning of the invasion during the first summer how obviously Russian oligarchs are very fond of the Riviera in southern France, but it's also the area in France that has received the most Ukrainian refugees who end up working in the hotels catering to these Russian oligarchs. And I don't know if that's still the case or if this has changed since then, but the numbers that you give us doesn't seem to indicate any change in that regard.
And now, a special interview that Dom recorded before his break with Ukraine's ambassador to Australia and New Zealand, Myroshnychenko Vasyl.
So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for talking to Ukraine the latest. Can you tell us how big an issue the war in Ukraine is in Australia and New Zealand right now?
Thank you, Dom. It's a great pleasure to be on the podcast. I've been tuning in every morning in Australia when I wake up and go for a run, so it's a pleasure to be with you. Look, I arrived in Australia 1 month into the war. It was March 2022. And soon after, I presented my credentials in Canberra. Then I presented my credentials in Wellington about 4 or 5 months later. And both countries have been standing very strong with Ukraine from the very beginning. I think that's that intolerance towards injustice that people in New Zealand and Australia feel. And they just saw a bully who was trying to change borders by force, who's pretty much pursuing his imperialistic conquest of subduing a democracy next door. And people reacted very strongly to that. And I have to tell you that during the last 3.5 years, being there as an ambassador, I've been observing that same strong support. Initially, it might have been a bit higher, but now I think there was a poll recently done by the Lowy Institute on Australia, which again demonstrated that over 2/3 of the people support more military assistance for Ukraine within Australia. And similar numbers are in New Zealand. It's still part of the public discourse. As a matter of fact, Ukraine was part of a political campaign in the most recent elections in Australia, which was quite unusual because foreign affairs very rarely make it to the political campaigns, not intentionally, but just the way it played out. And because of the leader of opposition decided not to support the coalition of the willing, Ukraine became part of the political campaign in a way. And of course, for me as an ambassador, I've worked with everybody in Ukraine. We have bipartisan support, and it's still there. It was just that one issue, which then have changed the debate a bit and got traction in the election campaign.
Yes, thanks. I was going to ask about the recent election campaign, going to ask how much of an issue it was on the campaign trail. You say foreign affairs became an issue and then the war in Ukraine very, very clearly followed on from that. Do you think Mr. Albanese would have raised it otherwise? Was he naturally leaning into this area, or was it a bit of political opportunism that he seized on that when his opponent raised the issue and he seized on it on the campaign trail? Would it have been there otherwise, do you think?
No, he was very supportive from the very beginning. Let me tell you, when he got elected in first time in May of 2022, he decided to come to Ukraine on the 5th week of his job. And it was a very strong statement given that Ukraine has never seen a prime minister of Australia. And he was just very recently elected. He went to NATO summit in Madrid, and then he came to Kyiv. And I will be forever thankful to him personally for doing it. And it was a very strong statement of support. And that was very well received in Kyiv and very well received by his people in Australia. So his support has been consistent, and the same for his whole government. Last year we had both Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister Richard Marles visiting Ukraine. More recently in December we had Foreign Minister Penny Wong, who paid a visit to Kyiv. And they are back, the same team is back in the government. So look, I read the commentary, and one of the comments I've seen was from Honourable George Prentice, who was Australian High Commissioner to London under the Scott Morrison government, and he spoke on Four Corners, which is an ABC program where they've been analysing elections. And he actually was quite surprised that Ukraine even featured in the elections, and he was surprised that there was a divergence on the approach on this particular issue, because Coalition, which is a coalition of conservative parties in Australia, has been very supportive of Ukraine. They were in the government when I arrived. They made the first decision to send Bushmasters to Ukraine. They also made several other packages of support of Ukraine. And Peter Dutton was as supportive of Ukraine as ever. You know, he's a good friend, and his whole team was very supportive of Ukraine. So that was just at that point of differentiation which differed, because in a way, we don't know if these peacekeeping troops will ever be deployed. And at the end of the day, it could be just 8 ATF soldiers from Australia who will be deployed and will be still considered a deployment. So it was a hypothetical question, but in a way that was different. And I think Labour just jumped on that and used it. And I think like Kika Berg, who you also know, she's written a blog post on this particular issue where she specifically said that it was one of the major mistakes done by Peter Dutton in this campaign. I mean, for me, it's difficult to make that assessment or make the judgment. I don't think that it was a major mistake. It was a mistake, but there were many other mistakes, and Labour did many mistakes as well. But, you know, in politics, it's always like that, and we have an outcome, we have the result. And, of course, the resounding victory of the Labour Party is quite impressive in what they've been able to achieve. But look, they have their own issues right now. Currently, as you know, Australian Prime Minister recently visited China. Of course, there is a review of the AUKUS by the U.S. There are issues related to the defense spending. And there is a clear link between security in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And this is what is developing. And this is how Ukraine is featuring much more prominently in Australia and New Zealand. Because when I arrived 3 years ago, some commentators, as well as some of the politicians, were saying that, well, this war is a long way away. It's up to NATO and Europe to deal with that. And we will, of course, help Ukraine, but we have our own issues in the region, which is quite reasonable. But more and more, we see how North Korean troops are now fighting with the Russians and helping Russians. We see Russian military conducting joint naval military exercises with Indonesia, just 1,300 kilometers away from Darwin, right? There was also, by the way, another issue popped up in the election campaign. There was a publication which reported that there was a request from the Russian government to the Indonesian government to use the air base in Papua for the refill of the Russian strategic bombers. By the way, many of those bombers that Ukraine ended up destroying in Siberia.
The big Tupolev Operation Spiderweb.
Correct, which could carry nuclear weapons, right? And at that time, it was part of the political campaign, and allegedly Prabowo said no and declined the request from the Russians. But the fact that there was a request, and we understand this very likely did happen, and the fact that they've been very cozy with the Russians in a way is really creating a different environment, geopolitical environment for Australia. And apart from all the tension that we see in the Indo-Pacific and how everything is closely intertwined, the question of energy policy, the question of food security, and also what's going to happen next. Because we do understand the way this war is going to play out in Europe will have a major impact on the security in the Pacific. And this is where Australia and New Zealand pay attention. This is where they are looking at lessons learned. And in a way, after this 3.5 years, for which, you know, we'll be forever thankful to all the Australians and New Zealanders and, of course, their governments for the support of Ukraine. But I think we can work together and we can actually improve the defense capabilities of both countries, especially with the new technology, the way we've been using our autonomous systems, underwater, in the air, on the ground. And this is something that I'm currently discussing with the Australian and New Zealand government, because the way we've been deploying new technology, military technology, and this is something that they should be keen to learn, keen to replicate, and we're willing to build our own production within those two countries to cater to their needs and to cater to the region as well. Because the way the technology is developing, there are only two countries in the world which currently can compete on that. It's Russia and Ukraine, because we have a battlefield, we are testing everything out there, but Russians are supplying to Iran, they're supplying to China, they're supplying to other states which are not friends of democracy. But for us, we are happy to work with the democratic countries who've been supporting us and helping to improve their defense capabilities.
You make a good point about the Bushmaster, the terrific armoured personnel. Well, they're more than an armoured personnel carrier. The British Army, we were using them in Iraq and elsewhere. They're absolutely superb. They were an absolute win. Australia supplied those to Ukraine. The NH-90 helicopters, that was a little bit of a wobble. Australia was going to get rid of, I think, a dozen or 16 of these medium lift helicopters and did not send them to Ukraine. I think they said they were too obsolete, would have taken too much work to get back into an operational frame. I just wonder how much this argument about supply of munitions and hardware to Ukraine that we see playing out in the US, with some people saying, well, no, actually, we should cut off this flow to Ukraine because we're going to need this in some potential future fight with China. Is that playing out at all in Australia, or is there still pretty much support both from the bipartisan political position and society for continued supply of military hardware to Ukraine?
Look, it's different. In Australia, it's different. But the challenge we are facing is that Australia does not have much that they can give, right? I mean, that's the whole challenge. As you know, Australia made a commitment to provide 49 M1A1 Abrams tanks, and 37 of them already have arrived in Europe and will be very shortly transferred to Ukraine, or actually already happened, right? So another 12 will be delivered towards the end of this year. So it's a significant contribution to Ukraine. Also, 120 Bushmasters has been supplied. As of today, we also have had M113 armored personnel carriers, which we use them for medical evacuation, as well as some artillery and ammunition. And we need this hardware. We need the hardware because the needs are huge. The question is how much of what else Australia can provide. And certainly Australia can easily provide another 200 Bushmasters. That's my argument, because Australia is producing those Bushmasters in Vitalis, Australia, in Bendigo, in the state of Victoria. There are actually many more of M113s, which have been pretty much decommissioned or about to be decommissioned. They could be very useful for us, especially if these vehicles are on tracks. And certainly anything else that we can do. But there could be some joint productions, like, for instance, energetics. I mean, Australia has energetics like hexagon and TNT, which is badly needed globally, but it's badly needed in Europe for the production of ammunition for Ukraine. And if we can ramp up the production of the energetics with the help of Australia anywhere in Europe, that could be of use for Ukraine. That would be very much welcome.
Now, Mr. Myroshnychenko, you've been there for 3.5 years nearly. On the diplomatic circuit, when you're meeting the other ambassadors to Australia, some of them maybe from countries that aren't as focused on the war as we are and as some others are, how is the issue received? How is the war received? How is your cause when you take this and you have these discussions with your diplomatic colleagues? How is it received there? And forgive me, does Russia still have an ambassador in Australia and New Zealand? And have you ever had any interactions with them?
Oh, actually, I haven't seen the one in New Zealand, actually, though I've been there 8 times. I never come across him. I haven't had a meeting, of course, with a Russian ambassador to Australia, but I've seen him at some of the receptions where he showed up at the reception of Indonesia or the reception of Saudi Arabia. Oh, there was another, I think, Emirates. He's left by now because his term has expired. He's been there almost 5 years. And I think there will be a new ambassador appointed shortly from Russia to Australia. Russians have attacked me, of course, publicly. They've been using their social media to attack me. He's been doing some interviews, actually. He's managed to do an interview with I think it was Australian Financial Review. There was an Australian who did the interview. He's trying to promote the Russian narrative. In a way, NATO is fighting the war to the last Ukrainian and stuff like that. But Russians don't get that much traction. Of course, on the far right and on the far left side of politics, you hear those views as anywhere else in the world. But they are not dominant. They are more marginalized, and they are there. I mean, it's a democracy. Of course, a lot of the Russian narrative is recycled by China, and as you know, Russian propaganda is amplified by Chinese propaganda within Australia. And if you look at what has been reinforced, all the Chinese population of Australia, which still is on Baidu or is receiving anything from official China, they get the Russian propaganda in Mandarin, of course, and it's all wrapped up as Chinese information, but it's all pretty much the same line, Kremlin lines, which you hear anywhere else. But apart from that, I mean, I'm very lucky in both countries, both Australia and New Zealand. The general population is very supportive. Actually, as a matter of fact, given that how much of a general population supports Ukraine, I do believe there's more room, both in Australia and New Zealand, for the government to do more. It's very safe. And as you know, we currently have a conservative coalition of parties in New Zealand, and we have a Labour government in Australia. But both of them remain committed, remain out there. Recently, Prime Minister Christopher Luxon had a meeting with President Zelensky on the sidelines of the NATO meeting. As you know, Anthony Albanese did not go to The Hague, but he sent his deputy, Rich Marles, who had a meeting with the defense minister there. We are working on the high level. There are several things that we're currently negotiating. I hope there will be another high-level meeting towards the end of this year or maybe early next year. So the intensity of our interaction is very high. I'm very pleased to be part of it, and I will continue to advance our bilateral contacts with Australia and New Zealand, especially as I've been doing from the time I landed in Australia.
And obviously this fits into the wider context of China and the challenge to the international rules-based order, international rule of law, the post-Second World War settlement. Are these arguments being made in Australia and New Zealand? Are they knitted together? Are they seen as individual threats and challenges that need to be addressed? Or is there a view that actually the world, the Five Eyes, of which Australia and New Zealand are part, this is the time where they need to really draw together to see off this challenge from this increasing block, if you like, of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea drawing together to really create problems for the world?
No, it's always intertwined, and everybody understands that it's part of the global geopolitics, and it's not separate. It's all part of the same conundrum that we're facing. The thing is that China and the way China, how dominant it is globally right now, China is now the main trading partner to 80-something countries, right, including Ukraine, by the way. And also, if you look at New Zealand and Australia separately, right, I mean, they have their own relationship with China, which differs, actually, and their relationship with America also differs, despite the fact they are all part of the Five Eyes, right? But still, I mean, policies differ and dependencies differ and the sizes of countries differ, and their aspirations also are divergent. The key issue currently for both of these countries is how to work in the Pacific. There are Pacific Island countries. I'm also responsible for 8 Pacific countries, and I see how geopolitics is changing. Just give you one example. I mean, with all the tariffs that the U.S., administration has recently been imposing in different countries like Fiji, for instance. I mean, Fiji is a very important player. It has 1 million people. It's more developed than other Pacific islands and countries, but at the same time, they export whiskey, right? That Fiji whiskey is exported to America. The tariffs which have come in made it impossible for their whiskey to be competitive on the American market. So China comes in and says, oh, look, you see, we're a reliable partner. We can buy more of your whiskey, and we're good guys. Do more business with us. And why don't you sign a security agreement with us, right? And in a way, the void that has been created in the Pacific is a huge concern to Australia, New Zealand, and Japan in that manner. And they're trying to fill in the gap that Americans are pulling out. They have to pull in. But, of course, if the more they get involved in the Pacific, the less they are able to be involved in Europe.
And is that the general feeling that the US is pulling out of the Pacific?
I mean, look, especially on the development side, which is obvious. Once USAID was axed, a lot of the money, which came for the Northern Pacific, by the way, especially for the Marshall Islands, for Micronesia, for Palau, I mean, this country has been relying on American support, right? Can it be substituted with Japanese support? I hope so, right? Can South Korea do something as well? Let's see. I mean, generally, development money and funding is what those Pacific, there are 18 or 19 of those countries, they dependent on the international development money. And if, for instance, UN agencies are not getting the funding, they're not able to do what they need to do. I've been to some of those countries. I've been to Kiribati. I've been to Tonga. I hope to visit Nauru and Solomon Islands. These are countries with their own challenges. And without even mentioning Papua New Guinea, right, which is there next door, which has a high population, is very important for Australia. And I see the challenges countries are facing. And they need the development money. They need the assistance from all the developed economies, and they rely on that assistance. And of course, the less America is present there, the more China will be present there, and everybody understands it.
Yeah, you mentioned obviously China there. You mentioned Russia trying to do a deal with Indonesia for an air base. Do you feel that these nations that all have a vote in the United Nations General Assembly and when they sit on the Security Council, do you feel that they are turning towards China? They see them as a more reliable partner?
So far, so good. I have to be frank. If you look at the votes in the multilateral system in the UN, generally Pacific Islands have been good on Ukraine, right? They've been supporting in line with Australia and New Zealand. They've been voting in line with the democracies, generally supporting. But every time it's in a huge outreach into work, which is done by the government of Australia, government of New Zealand. EU is also heavily supporting Ukraine in the Pacific. We've had Japanese as well, assisting as well. So Ukraine relies on the countries present in the region to do the advocacy on behalf of Ukraine in the region. And this is what part of my job is, to make sure that we regionally are there. Because, look, I have 10 countries that I'm responsible for There's not a single Ukrainian ambassador who has more than 10 countries. I do, and I have 2 international organizations. So I get a lot on my table with a very small embassy, but at the same time, these are all separate votes, right? And we have to fight for those votes because every vote matters in the UN General Assembly, in the UN Security Council, and especially there is a Pacific Island Forum, which is an annual high-level meeting, which this year is taking place in the Solomon Islands, for instance, which is a very important gathering for the region.
And just finally, on the industrial front, Ukraine is busy signing a lot of bilateral defence agreements with various companies for various areas, specifically in drone technology, but across the board. I mean, is Australia getting a slice of that pie? The Australian domestic defence industry is not great at the moment. It doesn't produce cars anymore, so how it's going to produce a nuclear submarine, I don't know. But what's the state of the Australian defence industrial base?
Look, it's not for me to comment. What I can comment is actually on the fact that Australia has been part of the drone coalition since April of last year. And as part of the drone coalition, Australia has been supporting Ukraine. They've been supplying some of the equipment. They've also been making donations to procure some of the equipment for Ukraine elsewhere. But as you perfectly know, in this drone world, innovation and technology is developing very quickly. So whatever was supplied to Ukraine from Australia, New Zealand, and other countries, we deploy to the battlefield. We see what works. We see what doesn't. We improve what works, and we actually make it already new technologies. So, for instance, if anything is supplied today, 12 months later, based on the experience and feedback we get from the battlefield, we make it better and actually produce something new, which is already new technology, which still works. Because, you see, whatever works, 3 weeks later, it doesn't work anymore, right? Because Russians come up with the countermeasures. And it works both ways, right? So innovation is in Russia and Ukraine at the neck-breaking speed. It's an arms race in a way. Who can make a better drone? Who can make a drone which can work in the night environment? Better precision, relying on artificial intelligence, whatnot, right? But it's so fast that conventional producers of drones, they cannot keep up with the pace of that development within Ukraine, for obvious reasons, of course.
Now, Mr. Ambassador, you've been in post nearly 3.5 years. That's a pretty good stint in diplomatic terms. So whilst there's no suggestion of moving on anytime soon, but it will happen one day. What would you miss most of your 3.5 years so far, and hopefully more, of your time in Australia and New Zealand?
Oh, look, there will be so many good things that I will be missing. But let me tell you, Australia and New Zealand has the best coffee in the world. I don't know how it works, but these people really know a lot about coffee. And I lived in the U.S., I lived in Canada, and I lived in UK. I'm sorry, guys, you don't have that coffee that Australians and New Zealanders have. I don't know why, but they have the best coffee in the world. Actually, I learned that the best coffee places in London are either Australian or New Zealand ones, but this is what I'm going to miss. Apart from, of course, the wildlife, the beautiful Pacific or Indian Ocean beaches and all of that. But look, I'm not there entertaining myself. You know, what I'm going to be missing, to be frank, is I'm going to be missing the people, because in my time in Australia and New Zealand, I learned so much about the countries, and I really have become part of local life. And all my friends are the Kiwis or Aussies. I'm traveling a lot to see them. I'm close to the defense industry. I'm close to many politicians. I know many people in the financial sector. So I've been out there networking, engaging, convincing people to support Ukraine, either, on a humanitarian side or looking into investment opportunities, into reconstruction, and rebuild. I was just here now at the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Rome, and I had a good catch-up with Dr. Andrew Forrest, who is one of the biggest philanthropists in Australia and who's been supporting Ukraine from day one. He's now committed another $5 million for demining of Ukraine. And already his commitment and actually contribution has already, as a charity, now been $30 million. And he's also made the commitment to invest $500 million into Ukraine's rebuild and reconstruction, into the rebuild of hospitals, schools, energy system, housing. And he recommitted himself at this Ukraine Recovery Conference. There are many other prominent Australians who are keen to support. For instance, Atlassian Group, it's a big tech company. The founders of Atlassian Group made a $10 million Australian dollars donation in 2022 for different humanitarian causes. And I'm very grateful to them. But there are many other philanthropists who have been donating money to Superhumans, have been donating money to Ukraine Crisis Appeal, which is another kind of Australia-driven charity done jointly with Rotary clubs. And there are many others, right? And I try to support every charity which is raising money for Ukraine because I believe it's important, and this is where my connections to these both countries will be forever.
Vasyl Myroshnychenko, Ukraine's ambassador to Australia and New Zealand, thank you so much for talking to Ukraine the Latest.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Francis, do you want to wrap this up with your final thoughts?
Well, thanks, Adélie. I was quite struck by something that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said relating to the trade deal with the US. Controversial, it has to be said, given some of the reactions in Europe, but it's not something that's specific to our purposes today, apart from when she said this: "We will also increase our energy cooperation. Purchases of US energy products will diversify our sources of supply and contribute to Europe's energy security. We will replace Russian gas and oil by purchasing significant amounts of US LNG, oil and nuclear fuels." Now, as I've mentioned before, when I was in Washington in September 2023, I interviewed Trump's former Deputy National Security Advisor, Victoria Coates, and she emphasised that if, and it was a big if back then, Trump were to win the presidency again, he would be keen to make the US an energy exporter to Europe. Given the war, that offered a win-win scenario for both the EU and the US. And it does seem that that is slowly, potentially playing out. Now, that gives Europe some leverage over the Trump administration in discussions relating to the war and outside of it. So it will be very interesting to see whether this is something that develops into a very important aspect of the future US-Europe relationship. We shall see. A small story, but one I thought was worth us noting.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.